Welcome back, everybody. I hope that you enjoyed your lunch and Mr. Huerta's remarks as much as I did. Now let's turn our sights to our next panel. Night Transportation Operations, Human Performance, and Fatigue. This panel has the unenviable after-lunch slot, and it's going to address, coincidentally, how to mitigate fatigue. Don Wykoff, a 737 captain with Delta Airlines, will moderate this panel. He is the chair of ALPA's Flight Time and Duty Time Committee, and he has been leading the charge on our fatigue mitigation efforts for many years. Don served on the FAA's Flight and Duty Time Aviation Rulemaking Committee and was instrumental in helping government and industry develop new science-based flight and duty time rules that are now in FAR Part 117. Don?
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. And welcome to the coveted after lunch spot talking about fatigue, and we'll try to enhance alertness here a little bit. What I want to do is a very quick introduction of our panelists here for you, and maybe to even set the stage a little bit further is to drop it back a little bit, go a little bit higher altitude, if you will, or whatever, mixing a lot of metaphors. But what we're really going to talk about here today in this panel is this. While we are in a cargo-centric seminar here, symposium, and appropriately so, we're going to drop back just a little bit, because what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about human beings and a wide variety of transportation modes working on the backside of the clock. And then when we do that, you'll be able to kind of get a feel through some of these different pieces of how different disciplines handle them, whether it be ground transportation, night cargo express, maritime, et cetera. But really what we're talking about is a human being working when they like to sleep. And how do we do that, and how do we handle it in the best way? So if I know everybody has their program, and there's a lot of great information on all of our panelists, but just a quick introduction from my left to right. Jerry Krueger is with us, and he's going to start us off in a minute from a ground transportation perspective. A very long and distinguished career dealing with a lot of that, and he'll have a little bit of a kind of a mini science lesson for us to help us set the stage a little bit along those lines. And then I'll turn it over to Evan Byrne from the NTSB, who's going to kind of fill in some of the gaps, talk a little bit about some issues that are out there, some things that could help us develop in and set the stage to talk about some modes of transportation. And then we can get to Rich Hughey, who you've already met on the first panel on the President's Cargo, just looking at the express cargo challenges on that backside of the clock and how we can take a look at it. And then we'll finish up with Klaus Luhta with a maritime perspective, which just is very interesting, because when we did our preparation, the more we talk about this, the more we see a lot of the challenges in the aviation community are shared with the maritime community. So I think that could be very interesting for you to hear some of those parallels and examine some of the concepts there. So as we run through the panel and we get started with Jerry here in a second, I'd really like you to think about that human on the backside of the clock. How do we mitigate that fatigue, enhance the alertness, and most importantly, as we listen to each of the perspectives here, what we can take away from each other to have a broader approach for all the different modes of transportation. So Jerry, would you mind getting us started?
As Don indicated, we want to talk a little bit about human fatigue, human operator fatigue, human operator in transportation. And we know that extensively long, irregular work schedules result usually in inadequate amounts of sleep, amount and quality of sleep. And this happens usually before the work stint itself, and then fatigue develops when you're on the job. So if we look at operational work shifts, the many job stresses in all of these modes of transportation, and some of them a lack of exercise, poor nutrition, individual lifestyle, health and fitness, all of these interact, and they affect the level of alertness, which is what this is all about. It's not about fatigue, it's about the level of alertness and how alert I am to operate my heavy equipment. And then, of course, that translates into the word that everybody wants to identify, which is fatigue. So if all of these threaten a worker's job safety and health, it really amounts to a public health concern, such so that the last day and a half, Administrator for the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, Mark Rosekind, some of you may know of him. If you hadn't, look 2 days ago in the news, because he took his job as an appointee, I think, last December. And within a week later, he fined Takata for the infamous case of the airbags in automobiles. 2 days ago, he fined them another $80 million. And so we're looking at a guy who's a mover, and of course you don't want to be operating your heavy equipment under the influence of sleep inertia, which can last 35 to 40 minutes for some people who are very subject to the effects of it. So when we shortchange ourselves of sleep on the job, our alertness starts to wax and wane, and the productivity declines, and all these are detrimental, of course, to your job performance. Now, I'd like to differentiate, as the bottom of the slide says, between acute fatigue and chronic fatigue. So if you're an employer and you have an employee who comes in, has been referred by the safety officer or whatever, you need to decide whether this person has acute fatigue. That is, he's been deprived of sleep for several days, maybe watched too much of the World Series on the East Coast and it was played on the West Coast in the month of October, and in fact has developed a sleep debt, and you make up that sleep debt over the weekend, of course. Now, I can talk in the next slide about how one makes up that sleep. That's called recovery sleep, but that's acute fatigue. It can be fixed by getting more sleep. Chronic fatigue, on the other hand, may have the accumulation of all kinds of personal stresses at home. My father needs surgery, my children are in trouble at school, or they're into drugs, or all these sorts of things that impinge upon that employee, in addition to the fact that repeatedly, week after week, they're going without a sufficient amount of sleep. There's also the stage of sleep that might be called the fifth stage of sleep, which is rapid eye movement or dreaming sleep. Now, if I took Don here, who's the perfect specimen, and I put him into one of the hotel rooms with perfect bedding, perfect temperature, turn off the lights, and I said, Don, your job is to fall asleep. And I have hooked electrodes to his scalp. That's why I picked him, because it won't mess up his hair. And I run the electrodes under the door into the room next to me, and I'm looking at the oscillographic traces for the amplification of his brain waves on that squash up there called the cerebellum. It looks like a football. I can see telltale signs that say he's falling asleep. And when I see the certain telltale sign that a polysomnographer looks for, and I say, he's asleep. I walk in, I say, Don, are you asleep? Well, no, I was kind of in a state of reverie. You would use that word, wouldn't you, Don? Yep. So he's in a state of reverie. 50% of the time I thought he was asleep. 50% of the time I'm going to be wrong. So I go back and I look at my oscillographic traces, and I find a telltale mark that I know how to recognize on those traces, and I go in and I say, Don, were you asleep? Now 100% of the time he's in stage 2 sleep. He will say, yes, I was asleep. I say, okay, I turn the lights off, let him go back to sleep. I go back into the other room and I look at it. Now I'm looking at big amplified waves that are bigger in amplitude but lower in frequency over time. And if I go in, he's in stage 3 and stage 4 sleep, and I say, Don, are you asleep? Don, wake up, Don. And he wakes up. Oh, man, you just woke me out of a deep sleep. And that's exactly how you feel. You woke up out of a deep sleep. That's when you can encounter the sleep inertia effects. Now, importantly, I mentioned that it takes some period of time to fall asleep, 8, 10 minutes, 12 minutes, something like that. Stanford University Medical School years ago, Mark Roskind's mentor was a part of this, decided to call it a multiple sleep latency test. They do this repeatedly, and if you fall asleep in less than 5 minutes, you're declared to be pretty darn fatigued. If you don't fall asleep within 10 or 12 minutes, well, you're kind of fatigued, but you're probably okay to do some work for a period of time. If after 20 minutes, however, you didn't fall asleep at all, you're declared to be alert. So that's the sort of indicator there. But if you fall asleep and you fall into the stage 1, usually in order, stage 2, stage 3, and 4, it's usually 45 or so, 50 minutes, 60 minutes when you get into stage 3 and stage 4 sleep. I say this because if you're going to use a napping strategy, again, part of Mark Roskind's research at NASA Ames was to show that if I take a nap for less than 45 minutes and I don't fall into stage 3 and stage 4 sleep, I get a benefit from that nap, and it doesn't affect my alertness so much because I haven't fallen into the stage 3 and stage 4 sleep and have to overcome the sleep inertia. So the commercial aviation industry hadn't adopted that nap strategy much. We're adopting it in the trucking industry in a spotty kind of piecemeal sort of a way. I think commercial airline industries in the Pacific Rim have in fact adopted that. So that's important to know the structure of sleep, however. Now, it says in between the several white vertical lines about 90 minutes. Well, typically, you go through the stages of sleep, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. The air conditioner turns on, I bounce back from stage 2 to stage 1. The dog barks, I bounce back and forth. I fall into these stages of sleep. Gradually and eventually, you're going to get into the rapid eye movement or dreaming sleep. It's known that the restorative value of dreaming sleep is very highly significant in stage 3 and stage 4 sleep. I won't go into all the ramifications of that. But if you get the work rest schedules from maritime industries and the naval vessels and so on, everybody said, get 4 hours of sleep in a contiguous singular bout. And the reason is because you can get 3 of those 90-minute cycles, assuring yourself you're going to get some stage 3 and stage 4 in rapid eye movement or dreaming sleep. So that's the value of doing it. In the oh, by the way category, not a very big audience, but how many of you in here think on a regular basis you remember your dreams? A show of hands. How many of you dream in color? Very few. Okay, you'll probably think about this with your loved one, your significant other. I would contend that mostly when I have an audience of 100 people, all the women in the room will raise their hand, they remember their dreams, and not very many men do. My suggestion is that most men sleep and dream early in their sleep cycle, and women probably dream later in the sleep cycle. So the women wake up, the recency factor, they remember that dream. But the men who had dreamt earlier probably don't remember the dream because the other sleep wiped out the memory of that. Anyway, that's to be proven in a scientific experiment, which would be expensive to run, but hasn't been done. Here's just kind of a plot that says, the normal idealized sleep schedule would be to sleep from about midnight to 8 o'clock in the morning, and it shows in the blue bars there some depiction of having bouts of rapid eye movement or dream sleep, and in between the slow wave sleep, stage 3 and stage 4, the high amplitude sleep, if you will. And it shows in the green waking 18 hours of that day. So that's the sort of idealized sleep you'd like to have. We'd be remiss if we didn't talk about circadian rhythms, the time of day issues that Don referred to for trying to sleep on the backside of the clock. So if you think about circadian rhythms as circa, being about, and dien being a day, it's about 24 hours. The globe circles almost 24 hours, and it goes around the sun 365 days, but the almost doesn't quite make it, and that's why you add in a day at the end of February for leap year. So the brain is always continually adjusting to the angle of sun that comes through the eyes and crosses the optic chiasm right about an inch below my finger, and it triggers the occipital lobe in the back, and it also triggers the pineal gland of the body to put melatonin into the bloodstream, which is a natural sleep sedative. The circadian rhythm then says my body temperature will rise every day, whether I'm awake or asleep, somewhere in the 4:35, 5:30 in the morning time frame. And it's going to rise steadily most of the day until the middle of the afternoon after lunch, the postprandial, post-lunch dip in body temperature. It levels off or it drops, and that's what you're seeing in that sine wave function drawn there. And it drops precipitously like a rock about 10:30 at night, and it stays on the lower level till about 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning, and that's the time where you have the second dip in circadian rhythm phenomenon. Now, what happens then, as you see in the second bullet down there, is that this 45-minute lull in performance, mood, and attitude, which you have in the middle of the afternoon, can be accentuated if you have it in the middle of the night, particularly if you have been sleep deprived. Everybody has it. The temperature change is only about 1.5 degrees. That's why the chart didn't show temperature. And in fact, most of the people who work through those hours a day are going to have a 10% to 12% decrement in performance, easily measured on a reaction time test. And if you've been sleep deprived, it may be as high as 15% drop. The third bullet down there says nighttime workers who sleep during the day, on the average, get about 1.2 hours less sleep, and typically the quality of the sleep they get is not so great. So the developing fatigue then degrades performance, productivity, leads to poor judgments, slower reaction times. So we've sort of hit that already. The shift workers on the second line down there getting 1.2 hours less sleep. Now reverting back to the normal daytime schedule on the weekend, if I work night shifts and then go back to living daytime schedule to be with my family's needs on the weekends, this causes what's called circadian rhythm desynchronosis, or disruption in my circadian rhythm. The physiology has a hard time adjusting to this every 5 days. And if you're a shift worker and you change your shifts every 3 weeks, it has another hard time doing it. It's much like flying to Europe and ending up with jet lag, something that you obviously experience a lot. The next bullet down talks about microsleeps. Microsleep, essentially the eyes could be open, but the brain is in stage 1 light sleep, and you're driving down the road. If you hit a rumble strip, it kind of startles you out of that microsleep, and now you're good to go, you're very alert. And then soon thereafter, you get another microsleep, and then another microsleep. They come quicker and longer in duration. So we usually tell the truck driver, if you get 2 microsleeps in the space of an hour, get your ass off the road and take a rest, because you may not find there are rumble strips to save you the next time, or you just might run over them and into the ditch you go. So the microsleeps is an important concept to keep in mind. So rotations of these irregular shifts makes it difficult. I think Don had mentioned earlier during the lunch hour, driving eastward into the sunlight at 5 o'clock in the morning is the toughest time to stay awake. Consequently, it's also the toughest time for a pilot who's flying eastward to do that. What's the reason for that? You've been awake for a long period of time. The brain has a tug of war going on between the propensity to say, you got to go to sleep. You've been keeping me up too long. And the arrival of that sunlight that's going into those eyes and hitting the circadian timing clock called the suprachiasmatic nuclei, it'll be on the test later, right below my finger. It says, wake up, dummy, the birds are chirping, it's time to go to work. And so when you're going in eastward into the sunrise, that is a really excessively tough time to stay awake, particularly if you've been sleep deprived. I'll skip through a couple of these things here. So what are some of the fatigue countermeasures? Well, get enough sleep before you go to work. Take rest breaks. Obviously not too easy to do in an aviation cockpit that doesn't permit you to do this, but the policy says you can do it. Mark Roskind's research says, good thing to do. Truck drivers, of course, could stop if they have a safe place to stop and if they're not being pressured to make a delivery on time. Napping strategies work. Make sure they're less than 45 minutes if you're going to wake up out of that sleep and go back to work. Recovery sleep on the weekend. The recovery sleep on the weekend, we'll tell the parents about this. When their kids have been deprived for sleep all week, they develop a sleep debt. Let them sleep on Saturday morning, for gosh sakes. They get the sleep that's coming back to make up for what they lost during the course of the week. If you look at the oscillographic traces in a polysomnography graph, it's a deeper form of sleep and there's more vivid dreams. And so they're getting the restorative recovery sleep as you as adults would as well. You could try sleep inducers, so there are sleeping pills that can be used. Melatonin comes from the pineal gland, 0.2 milligram of it put into the bloodstream automatically when adults about 10:30 at night. Interesting for teenagers, 11:30 at night. Mary Carskadden from Brown University was present in the meetings this morning, and people were fawning over her because she is their hero for helping the United States start to convert to later high school start times in the morning. In Fairfax County, Virginia, started in September. The lady who spearheaded that effort just went up, you'd have thought she was bowing down to kiss Mary Carskadden's feet because she so admiration of her research that showed that this is a difference with teenagers. Light stimulants, caffeine is the only acceptable, readily available that we can use. Modafinil is an ergogeric compound. It came from Paris. It's used in a drug called Provigil. It's an off-caliber use to use Provigil for people who have attention deficit disorder and things of that sort. But it has been used in many forms of military research to use it as a stimulant, because the nice thing about Provigil or modafinil is I can take it and I can still force myself to take a nap, whereas you can't do that with any other stimulant compound. But it's expensive, and so the Army is going back to caffeine as opposed to Provigil for the expense reasons. Okay, prescribed hours of service. You can look at the next 6 slides on your own. What's one of the ways that we legislate or regulate or try to get around this thing? The whole goal is to keep with physiology, to try and get people 10 hours off of duty so that they have time to drive home from their truck terminal to get potentially 7 or 8 hours of sleep and then come back again. For the truck driver driving across the country to deliver fresh produce from Long Beach to New York City, this is problematic because now he's stuck in a truck stop for 10 hours mandatorily and he's aggravated by this. I always say, that's exactly when you're supposed to go get your physical fitness. That's exactly when you're supposed to get your health back into shape, but nevertheless, hard to convince them of that. So if they follow the hours of service, they will be successful. Okay, these are the 6 slides. I'm not going to go over them. You have them drawn out on your page there, and hopefully that the people who are on the internet can see that as well. All of the modes of transportation then have a common set of obvious work problems. The truck drivers are unique because they essentially live in their truck. The transit people have split work shifts frequently. The labor unions become involved in some of the negotiating of bargaining agreements. Many employers don't screen operators for undiagnosed sleep disorders such as sleep apnea, and the training on operator fatigue is spotty at best. If we put into practice what we already know on operator alertness and fatigue, I would contend in a heretical way in the symposium the last 2 days is we don't need any more sleep research. We don't need very much, at least. We may need some specific pieces of it. We need to apply what we already know about this stuff, and we just have been remiss in not doing a good job of applying it. Obviously, if we convince the employers to do better scheduling, that's important, and the carriers need to be enlightened and get their employees involved and their families. The movements in the other industries, in particular trucking, is the kick toward health and wellness. If we impose upon them a philosophy, and get them to adopt a philosophy of health and wellness, why would you want to be a healthy truck driver who's worried about his diet and nutrition and counting up calories and proteins and what it is I eat, and then don't wear your safety belt or don't manage your sleep? Doesn't make any sense. That's a tough sell. It's a behavioral change. It's a cultural thing that we have to do. And the other initiatives are the medical examiners are now registered for truck drivers who get a physical only once every 2 years, unlike aviation, and it prevents them from going out and doctor shopping because now they have to pick a medical examiner who's on a certification list. And screening for sleep orders is the biggest, hottest, contentious issue in many of the modes of transportation outside of aviation. We can talk about that in the panel if you like. Education and training, there have been lots of education and training programs going around. The biggest one now available, called Death by PowerPoint, is the North American Fatigue Management Program, which is about 800 slides divided into 10 modules, and you can avail that to yourselves as well. End of speech.
Thank you, Jerry. Great stuff, Jerry. Thanks a lot. I think it set a nice stage there, and once again, kind of where we started off. Not really talking about anything other than it's all of us human beings trying to do something at a weird time of the day, or more appropriately at night, and the importance of sleep in that. So I think it sets a nice foundation. What I'd like to do now is ask Evan to take kind of pick the ball up and run from there, because with the safety board, I think he gets an opportunity to take a look at how these things are applied and some of the issues they go through, and some experiences in particular in different transportation modes of how this has come to bear a little bit. Sir?
Thank you, Don, and thanks, everyone. It's a pleasure to be part of this discussion and share some of the NTSB's work in this area. I'd like to start out by offering a little bit of a personal note. Michael, in the first panel from IPA, mentioned fine air, and that got me thinking that back in '97, that was the last all-cargo accident that I had in a series of 3 all-cargo accidents in my first 13 months at the NTSB. The predecessors to that, 8 days before fine air in Miami, FedEx in Newark, and then December 22nd, 1996, DC-8 went down, Abex Air in Narrows, Virginia. And a couple years later, in 2000, I had the opportunity to work the last fatal DC-8 accident in the United States, Emory Worldwide Airlines in Mather, California. So those accidents, sort of in the early days of my career at the NTSB, gave me a real good appreciation for the challenges and operational risks that this facet of the industry undertakes or faces every day. And another note, personal note, is that I can assure you that the families of the fatal accidents and the next of kin that I spoke with in those fatal cargo accidents sure experienced a significant loss, or at least gave that impression. So thanks, Michael, for raising that point earlier today. Let me move on to the concept of investigating fatigue at the NTSB. No less important than looking at the broken parts and pieces after an accident and trying to figure out what happened and why is looking at the human and the organizational systems that surround the accident and may have contributed or played a role. And as it relates to fatigue, one of the things that we do, our human performance investigators across all modes look at, we conduct interviews with next of kin and family, friends, coworkers. We review records, duty schedules, and collect data. There's a lot of electronic data that is helping us understand what recent activities someone is doing in the days before the accident. And our goal in collecting these data is not to be voyeuristic, but what we're trying to do is document what activities somebody was involved in. And by understanding what activities they were involved in and when they were awake, we can then create a profile or a pattern to understand what types of sleep opportunities the operator had in the days before the accident. And when we couple that analysis or that examination in terms of what types of sleep opportunities or potential to get restorative sleep someone had in the days before the accident with a good understanding for the nature of the mistakes that someone made during the accident sequence, we then are put in as good a position as we can get to understanding the role of fatigue in that accident. So the types of things that we look for when we are looking back at someone's 72-hour history or sleep-wake work-rest cycle is things that Dr. Krueger mentioned. Long time since awakening, being up for an extended period of time is something that is sort of a trigger for us that we are going to be seriously considering the role of fatigue. Acute sleep loss, not getting the normal 8 plus or minus 1 hours of sleep that that most people need. Chronic sleep loss, so reduced sleep over a period of days that accumulates over time. That teenage child that's sleeping in late on Saturday. Circadian disruption, shift work, that's the nature of this industry, but also time zone crossings in jet lag. And it's not just airline pilots, we're also talking maintenance and air traffic control as well. Sleep disorders, medical issues, and other factors that affect sleep quality is something that we are looking and reviewing these data to understand, are those present in someone's background. We then also move beyond the individual because people aren't working in isolation in this industry or many other industries. And we look at organizational factors, what support structures, guidance, training, policies, and procedures were in place as it relates to fatigue management and mitigation of fatigue. And the results of these investigations across all these modes show that the consequences of fatigue and the adverse effects on human performance are not just demonstrated in the laboratory. Clearly, there are catastrophic outcomes across all modes. Highway, most recently the Cranbury, New Jersey accident involving Tracy Jordan. That driver was up for an extended period of time, and the accident happened at night, and very little sleep was a part of the driver, and that was a fatigue-related highway accident. But accidents of this type also occur in the maritime industry, in rail, and of course aviation. In aviation, sort of the landmark accident as it relates to fatigue is the Guantanamo Bay, Cuba accident involving another DC-8. Captain Tom Curran was the first officer in that accident, and he remains coupled to the NTSB to this day. We teach a intermodal fatigue investigation course at our training center in Ashburn, Virginia. And Tom comes out every year to present a module on the Guantanamo Bay accident and share with the students in that class his firsthand experiences, both living as a fatigued pilot, the catastrophic consequences that befell him, and also ways to prevent and mitigate. So Tom is a good advocate as far as providing direct lessons learned on the consequences of fatigue in this industry. But there's been others since Guantanamo Bay in air carrier operations, both passenger, including Little Rock, Arkansas, Kirksville, Missouri, and Buffalo, New York. Cargo operations, we've mentioned some of those today, Tallahassee, Florida, Lubbock, Texas, and Birmingham. Overall, since about 2001 in aviation, there have been about 20% of the accidents involve fatigue as either a cause, contributing factor, or finding. And in the highway mode, that's up to about 40%. As Chairman Hart mentioned this morning, the reason most of us are at the NTSB is not necessarily to determine probable cause, although that's really what we're known for in terms of the press and public attention. What we're really there for is to try to prevent the next accident from happening and the safety recommendations that come as a result of our thorough investigations. More than 200 recommendations have been put forth by the NTSB to a variety of targets since the 1970s. About 1/3 of those have been directed or have been created by aviation. The aviation recommendations focus on a number of areas at the flight deck side, air traffic control, and maintenance. The topics that we've issued recommendations on in those areas involve rulemaking, policies, guidance, and education. The concept of the science-based rulemaking that has come up multiple times today, and that led to, that was one of our recommendations. We were championing that for about 15 years. Very early in my career at the NTSB, it was there, and it came to fruition with the Part 117 rulemaking. And when that rule came out, we closed that recommendation at the NTSB, acceptable alternate action. And that means we were satisfied, for the most part, with the action taken, that it met the intent of our recommendation. But we said alternate action because it didn't meet the intent completely. And where it fell down was it missed on one key point, and that was the exclusion of all cargo operations. So to conclude in my time here, fatigue is ever present. And our reports across all modes show that fatigue is ever present in the backside of the clock operations. And hour of service rules play an important role in the mitigation of fatigue, but it's not the only way to approach this hazard in our operational environment. Education and awareness and policies also play a significant role. And the key for safety, from my perspective, is the implementation of best practices, taking the knowledge that we know about fatigue and applying it and using it diligently. The increased awareness of how to mitigate fatigue. And that's a shared responsibility. The implementation of those practices demands both diligence on the part of the individual, but also the organization. And together with this shared responsibility, safety can be improved. Thank you.
Thanks, Evan. I think as we work our way down and we work through here, what we're really going to start to see as a little bit of a theme is that, and it was mentioned by the administrator, a wide variety of the work we've done here today is we've been living in this prescriptive world where we really just have something written on a piece of paper, and is it really working for the type of operations that we're doing and the type of days that we're flying, or evenings, the work schedules and that. And one of my takeaways from everything, particularly, but what Evan's talking about here, is there's a risk-based approach which requires all of us to kind of jump together and find those best practices, really be able to examine what's going on in particular operations and find a better way to do business. Every night there's just go on one of those flight trackers if you're having problems sleeping at 2 o'clock in the morning, and you can go commiserate with your FedEx and UPS buddies out there flying around. But right there in the skies with them, there's a lot of airplanes up in the air at night, whether they're flying the traditional midnight rocket from the west to the east coast. There's just a lot of activity going on, but there's clearly some areas where there's even an enhanced look on how to go do it. And I know after talking to friends at UPS and FedEx about this, the night hub sort 5 nights in a row is a challenge. It is a significant challenge on how to go do it. Clearly, it's being done, and it's being done well every night. Could we do it better? Absolutely. Is there better things to do? But I think one way to do that is to be able to go into more of a non-prescriptive, data-driven approach to taking a hard look at the problem and seeing exactly what we can do. And I think I'd like to introduce Rich now to talk about a lot of that, because there's a lot of great work that both FedEx and UPS has done with sleep rooms and strategies to be able to deal with that problem. That's really, I think, instrumental for all of us to take note and learn from. Rich?
Thanks, Don. Good afternoon, everyone. Rich Hughey back with you. So I've got a list of things. There it is. It's called an agenda. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that slide, but I'm going to basically start from big to small and finish with some conclusions. So the FedEx System form, 15,000 to 18,000 flight segments per month. It's a primary hub and spoke system with domestic sort facilities at those locations. 60% of our domestic sort is performed at night. We have international sort facilities in Anchorage, Paris, Guangzhou, and Osaka. Our secondary system is more of a point-to-point system that the passenger carriers are more familiar with, and that typically is on our international routes. We cover 171 cities with our trunk aircraft and 375 when we include our feeders. So the hub and spoke system, with the average sort time on the night side of 3.5 hours, 4.5 hours on the day side, the variation is quite wide. And the block hours, as I mentioned in panel 1, a cargo pilot average rough 27 block hours per month and passenger 47 per month. And the reason is because of that downtime during the sort, that we're sitting while the boxes are being shuffled and back onto their aircraft, instead of we're not sitting at a gate for 30 to 45 minutes waiting for the self-loading cargo. So that leads us to something the FedEx pilots felt very strongly about, and that was to get work rules that protected them. And as Michael Moody said, sometimes that's what we do. We end up paying for safety. And it's not necessarily the right way, but it is what it is. And our 2006 CBA, Collective Bargaining Agreement, was the first iteration of that, where we placed duty time limits based on the time of day for the show time. Very much like Part 117 is mechanized, except we only have 3 duty periods: critical, day, and night. 9 hours, 11, 30, and 13. I think I got those right. Critical is 9, night is 11:30, and day is 13. So we also have a flight time limit of 7:35 for our 2-man operations, and once we cross that, we add the third guy if it's a single segment, third pilot. So 36 off inside of 168 time away from base is a very common reset opportunity to get 2 local nights sleep, and we have that incorporated. The big thing of our 2006 CBA was the Scheduling Improvement Group, and that is best captured by, when you look at all the legal systems across the world, the U.S. is probably the best, as imperfect as it is. And when you look at all the scheduling committees across the airline industry, there's a lot of good ones, but I think the Scheduling Improvement Group and what we do is the best that it is. So with that, what is it? It's the group, the Airline Pilots Association has volunteers that team up with the company and build the next month's flight schedule. And the next month's flight schedule is already pre-built with a computer called the Optimizer. And there's a lot of names for it. That's what we call it, Pairing Generator Optimizer. And there's a lot of other names for it that I would lose my microphone privileges if I remarked. But with that, the PSIT, Pilot Scheduling Improvement Teams, about 30 ALPA volunteers, review the pairings generated by the Optimizer. We have 2 sets, prelims and finals, and they review those for a lot of areas, fatigue being one of them. And we take those pairings and we hand build them onto regular lines based on reasonable crew force desires and quality of life. And if we find pairings that we find objectionable, we submit them to the dispute process. And that's where the 2 lead members of the Scheduling Improvement Group on the ALPA side team up with the 2 lead group members on the company side, and we argue about them. And if any of them make it out the other side as disputed pairings, they're presented to the crew force, and the crew force gives feedback in relation to what they think about their experience flying one of these disputed pairings. Not a perfect process, but like I said, better than anything else out there. The outcome of disputed pairings sometimes has a positive, and that is a soft parameter is generated which constrains how a pairing is designed going forward. And the pairing DNA, the objectionable sequence, is what we target, and that's how we get better with our schedules. So in 2011, we added on to that collective bargaining agreement in the scheduling sections with a fatigue risk management group and a data collection steering committee. And our most recent TA that was just ratified, we added the FRMG into the dispute process. So now, instead of pitching those disputed or objectionable flying pairings to the crew force, we're actually going to gather data on them, and that's going to generate the soft parameter. So data-driven soft parameters. We also found that 36 and 168 wasn't quite adequate when you start flying through the international point-to-point system, because a lot of times there's only one sequence per city. So you land at 2 in the afternoon, that aircraft departs 3:30 that same afternoon, but you lay over for 24 hours and you have a work-rest shift usually of somewhere between 8 to 10 hours. And so 32 and 120 for greater than 5 time zones east and west is meant to alleviate that disruption, if you will. We also have an 8 and 24 setup where we're going to better manage West Coast cities that we fly into the hub facilities. So fatigue mitigation, pilots do a lot of it. They self-manage. They take naps when they need to take naps. And the scheduling improvement group is part of that. We get feedback from our pilots, and we use that feedback to better our pairings, better our trips. We also have the FRMP. Everybody's familiar with that from the FAA. And we have the FERC, Fatigue Review Committee, and of course the FRMG. They all play a part in that feedback mechanism for objectionable flying or for pairings and trips that we fly that we think are objectionable because of fatigue. So day of ops, we have a pilot wake-up program in case we have a weather event, and duty extensions usually follow that. So we put guys in our sleep rooms that you see to the side there, and those pilots rest until they're called. And so they're basically building up their alertness through sleep, and when they get called to go out on the backside of that sort facility, they're better off because of it. Data collection in the FRMG, we want to understand our sleep patterns, when we take naps, how good is our post-duty sleep, and maybe if we nap before we go to work, and the effects of the local time on the layover, the local base time, residential time where that pilot might commute from, and the effect of light on how sleep is. We had 450 pilots so far participate, both night hub turn studies and international studies, and we've captured 5 million data points on those sleep studies. The night hub turn study, all volunteers, communicated ahead of time, and then once they're given an actigraph to wear for the flight, for the whole trip, and they actually put it on a few days before the trip starts to get that 72-hour look back, and then that data is captured. They keep a sleep diary. They use a Sam Pirelli fatigue scale and the Karolinska sleepiness scale. And the analysis of the 4 night hub turns, if you like scatter plots, red is Indianapolis, blue is AFW or Alliance. What we found is because of the way the pairings were structured, there was a longer sit in the Indianapolis sort, so the pilots got more sleep time in the hub. The Alliance pairings were shorter, therefore they didn't get as much, but there's a good outcome on the end of this. So you can see on the bar graph there, and it shows the sleep over the 4 nights between the different hub turns. What we found was the Indianapolis hub turns, usually you started your duty earlier in the night, and you had a longer sit time, like I said, and your end time was later in the morning. But on the AFW hub turns, they'll start a little bit late, and you ended up local time getting in. Usually it's a West Coast kind of trip because Alliance is on the, it's in Texas, vice where Indianapolis is, closer to the Northeast. So those folks were getting in at 4 a.m. local time, and that meant they got to bed before the sun came up. So that was the benefit of that way of doing a night hub turn, whereas the Indianapolis benefit was having to sleep during the hub turn. So I already iterated what those takeaways were right there. Both validate the alertness levels for greater than 3 consecutive night hub turns, and at least from a sleep perspective. So we did also an international point-to-point study on 5 to 15-day trips that basically transit the globe. It's not surprising to anyone that if you transit a lot of time zones when you fly, circadian gets desynchronized. And I already mentioned the frequencies into the layover cities, and that work-rest schedule shifting, usually to the right, not always, but usually to the right. Our solution was negotiated in the recent TA as adding a 32 and 120, which actually starts at the 88-hour mark, time away from base. So you've been 88 hours into the trip. That's when you start getting that opportunity to get what we call a reset, 32 hours. So looking at the science-based regulations, very prominent medical doctor and NASA scientist spoke to me at about a year and a half ago, and he says, "Hey, Rich, science, the definition, explains the observed." And I went, all right, English is my second language, math is my first, let me work with that. So I said, we've observed 30 years of 4 to 5 night hub turns at FedEx. We just haven't had the opportunity to capture the science of that operation. Another prominent sleep scientist said, hey, Part 117, a great success. Great success. Very passenger-centric, because time wasn't allowed to give to the harder problem of solving the night hub turn issue. So we're limited in Part 117 to 3 Wackle incursions unless you pursue an FRMS, and your sleep opportunity in the Wackle during that hub turn needs to be 2 hours. The other side of the Atlantic in Great Britain, they have a different way of looking at night hub turns, and that's the cumulative duty look back, and it actually looks like the AFW hub turns. So when you get past 3 nights in a row, you've got to have only 8 hours of duty per night. So when you hit, and I'm going to do public math here, when you hit 3 nights in a row, 24 hours cumulative duty on your look back, 32 hours at the 4 night, and maximum of 40-hour look back of cumulative duty during night operations. So they constrain how long you can work when you work through the night, instead of saying, oh, we can work you longer because you're going to get a sleep opportunity. So there's different ways to do night operations successfully, both science-based rules. So conclusions are there's many ways to operate at night. I gave you 2 different ones. We also have what we call a 12-24 setup, where we launch out of the critical to a long block destination, usually the West Coast. We sit for 12 hours, and then we come back, and it's a night duty period, but you land probably about 1 a.m., and then you're off for 24 hours. And so that's 2 Wackle incursions, but they're shorter duty periods, much like I described with the AFW turns. So the other night duty that we perform is what's called an AM out and back, and that's you launch about 4 a.m., get to a layover, or not a layover city, but a turn city, and about an hour and a half later you come back. And according to our CBA, you have to be back on deck by 10 a.m. So maximum duty limit for us is a one-time shot. It's not what you can go to in sequential nights. And so that's an important aspect to honor when building schedules. And our company does a decent job. It's one of the things that we flag as part of the SIG. If we see sequential night hub turns pushing within an hour of that night duty limit, we flag them and we ask them to rebuild them. Trip revisions and extensions. This is going to be the friction point that a TA isn't necessarily going to capture, and Part 117 was pretty constraining, and I imagine with FedEx and UPS looking at Part 117, this is their long pole in the tent. It's also where we have 40 to 50% of our fatigue events, because when you're showing up for work and you've got a physiological gas tank that says, I've got 12 hours in me, and you get extended to a 14-hour mark, you've got to make a decision, maybe at the 8-hour mark, before you take that. And that's not based on how you feel at the moment. That's based on what your norm is, what your sleep has been over the past 3 to 4 days, and whether you think you're going to be alert on the far end of that 14-hour duty. So that's where most of our fatigue events occur, and Fourth bullet there, cumulative lookbacks are probably one of the best tools at predicting fatigue events. And I like the way the CAP 371 kind of mechanized themselves to be predictive that way. Pilot input and fatigue models, we use both of those at FedEx. We have the Safety Fast model that ALPA FedEx has a subscription to, and the company also has theirs. And the input of the pilots is very, very important because, as one other prominent fatigue scientist said, no fatigue model is better than the operational experience of the worker. So pilots, they do self-manage. They do. Not all of them, but most of them. And the other thing that we all have to work through as partners with our companies is, there's an appetite out there for efficiency. And, there's only so much blood in a turnip. So that's the friction point, and we work together to keep ourselves with margins that we can work with and efficiencies that the company can point to that they're happy with. So that's my takeaways. I appreciate the microphone privilege for the few minutes that you gave me. Thank you.
Thanks, Rich. Great review, because I think it gives a good look at that type of operation and the challenges that there are out there. I think it also identifies that this prescriptive versus risk-based and data-driven approach, because a couple bullets you had on the end there, Rich, really drive home to me that there's a need for some margins. You got to have a little bit of slop, and that's the problem with a prescriptive system. And we went round and around, whether it's in ARC or international symposiums and everything, and everybody in the world will tell you, hey, the prescriptive limit's not supposed to be a target. It's a target, okay? It is, and a risk-based approach is trying to find some margins depending on what you're trying to do. And it's a commercial thing. We're going to deal with the commercial side of it. It's not going to go away, so we have to figure out how we're going to do it. And one of the guys that I do some stuff at Delta with on our fatigue safety action group he always has kind of a humorous little thing about an optimizer. And not to get any ugly names, but he goes, basically an optimizer does this to your schedule. It's the same thing your teenage daughter does to figure out how she gets back a nanosecond before her curfew's done. It's just going to drive you. That's what it's designed to do. Okay, it's an efficiency thing. So how you put your buffers in that you can still have your commercial interests taken care of, but also be able to handle it. And another takeaway there, Rich, also on the passenger side is our soft spot on extensions. Now you're spot on. It's when you start approaching that time in the WACL, when you start bumping up around 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, is where you run into the problems when you have extensions on day flyers or the late evening and that. It's just the soft spot, and you can't run it right to the hard line all the time. There's got to be a little wiggle room through there. So appreciate all that, because I think it's very helpful for everybody that deals in any kind of flying on the backside, because there's a lot of takeaways in there, from sleep rooms to how you get rest and the importance of naps and so on and so forth. So next I'd like to introduce and give the floor to Klaus Luhta from the International Organization of Masters, Mates, and Pilots. When I was involved in ALPA work, I had the opportunity to do a little more work with these guys over time, and I continue to be amazed at the parallels that we have in our industries between the maritime industry and aviation, and not only on some of our commercial things that we're talking about off the side, but on risk-based fatigue, general operations and that. So I think this would be a very interesting perspective. And Klaus, you have the floor, sir. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Don.
Thanks.
Appreciate you letting me participate in this panel with these distinguished experts. It's an honor to be here today. I'm really impressed with how data-driven your analysis is, and it's remarkable that when there's the possibility of an aircraft potentially due to an error falling out of the sky, how it takes on such a significant degree of importance. With ships, we're an ancient industry, and at the end of the day, it's a piece of metal with a turning screw on the stern just pushing through the water with a bunch of cargo on there and people as well. So I think from our perspective, one of the maybe differences is that we're not as driven by the data, or at least it's not taken as seriously, and I wish it would be, because it has a significant impact on operations and fatigue and things like that. I noted at least one similarity between the two industries when Administrator Huerta was making his comments, and that relates to funding. Just as the FAA is struggling for funding, the maritime industry in America is always under constant pressure for additional monies to keep the American flag flying on merchant cargo ships. One very significant difference is that when an aviation incident occurs, from what I understand, the industry comes together to find out what went wrong, remedy the problem, and move on and improve. Whereas in the maritime industry, it's more of perhaps a fault-finding pursuit. And so I think that impacts the honesty of the people involved, particularly when there are survivors to an incident. And that dichotomy there, I think, has a dramatic impact on how mariners interact with the companies that they work for and the unions that they belong to and things like that. But today I'll focus on fatigue. I'll just kind of give you an overview of our operational considerations, and you can draw your own parallels as to how they compare. So there are similar challenges. The time frames are different. You know, on a merchant cargo vessel, if we're looking at a coastwise transit coming back from Northern Europe, for example, you're looking at about a 14-day coastwise intense operation. And then you're back out to sea, going over to Northern Europe to do a similar type transit, and then coming back and doing that rotation, typically for about a 70-day period. And then the mariner will get off the ship and go rest at home and go skiing and enjoy their recreational time. But our overarching goal as mariners is to get the cargo safely to its destination with everybody safe on board, no injuries, no deaths, and no environmental pollution. And so I'm just going to go over what a typical coastwise run would be. So what I'm referring to are the large merchant cargo ships, container ships that you see in the ports when you drive by the Port of Baltimore or whatever the large city port is near you. And so a typical run would be a ship returning to the East Coast and visiting the following ports: New York Harbor, Norfolk, Jacksonville, Houston, Charleston, probably back up to Norfolk again, maybe New York one more time, and then back out to sea and across the Atlantic. So oftentimes less than 24 hours are spent in port, and that's strictly for cargo operations. There's no recreational consideration there. There's no rest consideration. Ships arrive and depart at all hours of the day and night. Cargo operations are performed at all hours, and transit between ports is continuous. So the one person I'll point to is the chief officer, the chief mate, and he typically has the largest workload. And so he'll stand, or she will stand, a 4-hour navigation watch followed by an 8-hour break and another 4-hour navigation watch. One of those 8-hour periods is devoted to rest, hopefully, and then another 8-hour period is devoted to other work, additional duties that the chief mate has. When you're coming into port, the chief mate will stand his watch, assist with docking the vessel, tying up, and then dealing with the additional duties that come with cargo operations. Longshoremen come aboard, port personnel come aboard, there's processing of paperwork, there's interaction with crew who may be departing the vessel and coming aboard. So there's all of that regardless of the time of day, and the chief mate has to be awake and alert for it. You know, there aren't really safety implications right off the bat with that. But as time goes on and fatigue sets in, it becomes more of an issue. Longshoremen come aboard, cargo operations are performed, cargo is loaded, cargo is discharged, the turnaround is performed, and the ship leaves port. The chief mate assists with untying the vessel, and then maybe in that process he'll get a few hours of rest if it's a nighttime cargo operation. The ship transits down to Norfolk, and the process begins again. And then again in the other ports. And so cumulatively, as time goes on, the chief mate really doesn't get much rest. He's working cargo, he's dealing with people, he's standing his navigational watch. At some points, the junior officers will assist with covering some of his watches so he can get rest, but really, there isn't much sleep until the ship finally leaves the coast and goes across the Atlantic. So there are a number of studies that have dealt with mariner fatigue, and the overarching conclusion has been that if an individual stays up at night, they have a tendency to fall asleep on watch. And, study after study confirms that. Mariner work tends to be irregular, both in terms of its timing during the 24-hour cycle and in relation to the duration of on-duty periods and time off between work assignments. It depends, of course, on route characteristics and operational requirements, but in today's competitive cargo environment, all ships are really under the same pressures. There's some studies here I noted, but I don't think we really need to cover this. Jerry did a great job of the science behind things. But the chief mate that I mentioned, after 14 days of this intense operation with very little rest, you have to imagine that the cumulative fatigue that she experiences just has to take a toll. And so then her decision-making process takes a toll as well, and perhaps is not as mentally acute as she was when the ship first came in. We like our mariners to be awake when they're standing their navigation watch, particularly when the ship is near your favorite coastal vacation spot. So that's kind of our goal. But these sleep deficits accumulate, and like I said, it's a 70-day rotation. So by the end of that time, as a mariner, you're completely exhausted. You stumble off the ship, you take your bags with you, you go home and sleep for a week, and then you just wait until the next time you come back on the vessel. Operationally, really, I think that sums it up. The other thing that factors into it, the fatigue issue, is when the ship leaves the coast and heads out into the ocean, there are certain stresses with the ship and the day-to-day work, vibration, noise, things like that. But there are also the time changes as you go across. So you have to account for 5 time zone changes over a 9 or 10-day span, depending on how fast the vessel travels. So the unconventional work hours, it just causes disharmony between a person's circadian rhythm and the normal social and environmental, what they call Zeitgebers in this particular study. They've tried to mitigate this with regulation. I do a lot of work at the International Maritime Organization in London, and so they've come out with standards for watchkeeping and training, and part of that is rest and work hour requirements, but they're not nearly as prescriptive as it seems they are in aviation, but we're working on adopting those and incorporating them into our operational structure. The constant tension for us is that the options are either, if you have vessel crew who are not sufficiently rested, you can either stop the ship, go anchor, and then you're not running cargo, or you can falsify your logs, which has criminal implications, or maybe the best solution would be to add personnel on board the vessel, an additional navigation officer, perhaps for the coast-wise run. All of these things are weighed, but they're counterbalanced by the fact that shipping companies don't really want to spend the money. So as it is right now, there's always the financial consideration. We're just sort of kind of finding our way through it. Some of the companies that operate ships that we're aboard as masters, mates, and pilots, they have added an additional third mate, so that's provided some relief for those particular officers, but other ships just go through and do these kinds of runs without much consideration, just hoping that there won't be an incident. And unfortunately, that's not good enough for me, and it's not really good enough for our personnel, but it's the nature of our industry, and I'm really happy to be here because I think we can learn a lot from you and the approach that you take, and I'm definitely going to take some of this back and share it with our industry, so thank you.
Yeah, it's great to have you with us because I think, there's just, it's interesting how it works. There's this commercial, and while the speeds may, are not similar, there still is out there, you're not going to stop, you're going to continue going, things along those lines. So really appreciate it. I hope you can see some of the parallels with all these things and how we can, learn from each other.
I actually have a question.
Yeah.
For Dr. Krueger, very quickly, if you could. In terms of melatonin, which you mentioned, is there any evidence that using an increased dosage of melatonin will help with turning yourself to day sleep and then vice versa when you're trying to get on back into a night sleeping schedule?
Well, a pretty tricky question. Melatonin is a natural sleep sedative hormone that comes from the pineal gland of the body about an inch below my finger. It's triggered by the onset or the offset of light in terms of at nighttime, adults will get it 0.2 of a milligram into the bloodstream about 10:30. Unless you're age 70, when you're not going to have much melatonin, men start getting a decreased amount of melatonin at age 25, and subsequently by age 70 you have almost none. So in the trucking industry, we prescribe to them that they should think about using synthetic melatonin. Now, synthetic melatonin is sold in capsule form in any health food store, GN nutrition stores, etc. Unfortunately, it's sold as a health food and it's not governed by good manufacturing practices for the Food and Drug Administration, and consequently, we don't know exactly what's in that tablet. Pure melatonin is used in research by all the military research labs. So we find you don't need to give them 100 milligrams of melatonin. You're wasting a lot of melatonin. A small amount of melatonin will do to get the fatigue, the sleep-induced effect that you'd like to do. If you talk about the natural melatonin, your bloodstream stops getting melatonin from that pineal gland at the onset of daybreak, and whatever melatonin is in the body starts to dissipate. So if you use synthetic melatonin, you want to be in a darkened environment because the light will cause the melatonin in your bloodstream to dissipate. So you have to, one, know the quality of the melatonin you're getting, and you don't know that from the Food and Drug Administration not governing those pills. There was a chemistry lab in Cambridge, Massachusetts some years ago that tested 12 different commercially available synthetic melatonin tablets and found there wasn't any real rhyme or reason to what was said on the bottle and what was actually in the pill. That is, the pill is a 50 milligram tablet, and how much melatonin is in it. Well, the tablet is big, but the melatonin that's in there is a small quantity, and they don't tell you how much of that's in there. So we don't know the quality of the melatonin you buy synthetically. You can't exactly control the melatonin that you get normally without using synthetic melatonin, but you can assure yourself that you're going to use the synthetic melatonin, and it might happen to help you, even if it's just psychologically going to convince you that it works. Go into a darkened environment, make sure that, for example, the truck driver is sleeping in a sleeper berth and he's got complete blackout conditions, a little whirring motor on the parking lot to mask the noise in the background, and some of them swear it works. Whether or not you can use it to bring yourself back to the daytime, nighttime desynchronization schedules is obviously something on a trial and error basis that you have to try it and see if it works for you. People claim that it works to overcome jet lag, and they do quite well with it, but there's not a sufficient amount of good scientific studies using pure melatonin, scientific or chemical quality melatonin, to really answer your very useful and tricky question.
Yeah, thank you,
It's a
Doctor.
good thing if we can
Appreciate
support
that.
the research for it, it ought to be done.
Thank you. And thanks to all of you. For those of us who spend a great deal of our time trying to stay awake while we fly over those who sleep beneath us, I think that was a very informative panel. Thank you very much.